It was one of those freezing winter nights where the chill seeped into your bones, no matter how many layers you wore. The streets were quieter than usual, blanketed by a silence only broken by the occasional gust of wind or the crunch of snow underfoot. That's when Officer James spotted him. A young boy, no older than 10 or 11, walking alone on the icy pavement. What stood out wasn't just that he was alone so late. It was what he wasn't wearing: shoes. The boy's feet were bare, red and raw from the cold, leaving faint imprints in the snow that disappeared almost as quickly as they were made. His clothes were thin, ill-fitted, and looked like they'd been handed down a few too many times. He had his arms wrapped tightly around himself, his head down as if he were trying to make himself invisible. James pulled his patrol car to a slow stop, watching for a moment through the frosted window. He wasn't new to scenes like this. As an officer in a struggling neighborhood, he'd seen plenty of hardship. But something about this boy, trudging silently through the biting wind, struck a chord. It wasn't just pity, it was something deeper. He got out of the car, the snow crunching beneath his boots, and called out, "Hey kid, you okay?" The boy froze, his head jerking up. His eyes were wide, filled with fear and suspicion, darting to the badge on James' chest. He didn't answer. Instead, he looked ready to bolt. "Hold on," James said, softening his voice and raising his hands as if to show he meant no harm. "I'm not here to get you in trouble. I just want to help." The boy hesitated, his stance stiff. He looked down at his feet, his lips trembling, not from the cold, but from something else. James could see it now, the way the boy's shoulders hunched, the way his breathing quickened. This wasn't just a kid out in the cold. This was a kid carrying something heavy, something no child should have to bear. James reached into his car and grabbed a spare blanket he kept in the trunk for emergencies. "Here," he said, draping it over the boy's shoulders. "It's too cold to be out like this. Where are your shoes?" The boy's eyes dropped to the ground again. "Don't got any," he muttered almost too quietly to hear. James frowned. "No shoes in this weather." His gaze drifted back to the boy's feet, red and swollen from the cold, and something inside him twisted. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated, then whispered, "Malik." "Okay, Malik. Look, I can't let you stay out here like this. You'll get sick, or worse." James crouched to meet Malik's eye level, trying to make himself seem less intimidating. "Do you live nearby? Can I take you home?" Malik's face tensed at the word home. He shook his head, pulling the blanket tighter around himself. "Don't got one," he mumbled. James's stomach sank. He didn't press further, not yet. Instead, he took a deep breath and said, "All right, let's get you somewhere warm first. Come on, hop in the car." Malik hesitated again, his small frame trembling in the cold, but eventually he nodded. He climbed into the patrol car, and James cranked up the heat. As they drove toward the station, James kept glancing at Malik in the rearview mirror. The boy's guarded expression didn't waver, but there was a flicker of something else now. Maybe relief, maybe hope. When they arrived, James handed Malik a pair of spare boots from the station's donation box. They were a little too big, but they were better than nothing. As Malik laced them up, James noticed something strange. The boy's hands were steady, practiced, like someone who had done this many times before. It made James wonder just how long Malik had been surviving like this, and what had brought him here tonight. What happened next would change not just Malik's life, but James too. It was a moment neither of them could have anticipated, one that would leave their small community in shock. Because as James would soon discover, there was much more to Malik's story than bare feet on a cold night. And what came after would amaze everyone, especially James. James watched as Malik tucked his feet into the oversized boots. They weren't perfect, but they were warm, and that was what mattered right now. The boy's shoulders seemed to relax just a little as he felt the warmth spread through his toes. But still, there was something guarded about him, like a cornered animal that wasn't quite sure whether to trust the hand being offered. James pulled up a chair across from Malik in the small break room, the hum of the old radiator filling the silence. "You hungry?" he asked. Malik shrugged. It wasn't a yes, But it wasn't a no either. James grabbed a vending machine sandwich from the fridge and slid it across the table. Malik stared at it for a moment before carefully unwrapping it and taking small, deliberate bites. "Malik," James began gently, "I need to know more about you. Are you living on the streets? Do you have anyone, family, friends, who can help you?" Malik didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the sandwich, chewing slowly as if he were weighing his words. Finally he said, "I used to live with my mom." His voice was so quiet James had to lean in to catch it. "Used to," James prompted. Malik nodded, his fingers tightening around the sandwich. She's not around no more." James felt a pang of sympathy. What happened? He asked carefully, not wanting to push too hard. Malik's face clouded over, and he didn't answer. Instead, he shoved the rest of the sandwich into his mouth, chewing quickly, as if trying to distract himself. James let the silence hang, giving Malik space. After a while, Malik looked up. His dark eyes, so much older than his years, met James's. "I've been on my own for a while now," he admitted. "I know how to take care of myself." James shook his head. "No kid should have to do that," he said softly. Malik's expression hardened. "It's better than other places." James caught the slight hitch in Malik's voice and the way his hands fidgeted in his lap. "What do you mean by that?" Malik glanced away, his jaw tightening. "Foster homes," he muttered. "Group homes. They're supposed to help, right? But they don't. Not really?" James nodded slowly. He'd heard stories before, stories that made his blood boil. He couldn't imagine what Malik had been through, but he could see the weight of it etched into the boy's every movement. "Look, Malik," James said after a moment, "I'm not going to force you into anything. But I can't just let you go back out there. It's too dangerous. Let me help you figure this out, okay?" Malik stared at him, his expression unreadable. "Why do you care?" he asked finally. The question caught James off guard. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair as he searched for the right words. "Because no one deserves to be alone in the cold," he said. "Not when there's someone who can help." Malik didn't respond, but the hardness in his eyes seemed to soften, just a little. As the night wore on, James tried to piece together more of Malik's story. He learned that the boy had been moving from place to place, staying wherever he could find shelter. Abandoned buildings, bus stations, even under bridges when he had no other options. He avoided shelters because they were too crowded and too loud, but James suspected there was more to it than that. He also learned that Malik was smart, sharper than most kids his age. He talked about how he figured out which stores were most likely to leave their dumpsters unlocked or which streets had the least police patrols. He spoke with a mix of pride and bitterness, as if surviving had become both his greatest accomplishment and his greatest burden. But there were still so many unanswered questions. Where was his father? Why wasn't anyone looking for him? And most importantly, why was he barefoot in the middle of a freezing night? James wanted to dig deeper, but every time he pressed too hard, Malik would climb up, retreating into himself. James knew he had to tread carefully. Trust was fragile, and it was clear Malik didn't give it easily. Around midnight, James decided to take Malik to a nearby emergency shelter run by a local church. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was warm, safe, and staffed with people James trusted. As they drove through the quiet streets, Malik stared out the window, his face lit by the orange glow of the streetlights. "You'll like this place," James said, trying to sound reassuring. "They've got good people there. They'll take care of you." Malik didn't respond. When they arrived, James walked Malik to the door, where a kind-looking woman greeted them. "Officer James," she said with a warm smile. "Who's this?" "This is Malik," James said. "He needs a place to stay tonight." The woman crouched down to Malik's level, her smile never wavering. "Hi, Malik. I'm Sarah. We've got a warm bed and some hot food inside if you're interested." Malik glanced at James, then back at Sarah. After a long pause, he nodded. James watched as Sarah led Malik inside, his small frame disappearing into the cozy warmth of the shelter. A part of him felt relief. Malik was safe, at least for now. But another part of him couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story. Later that night, as James sat in his patrol car, staring at the snow-covered streets, he couldn't stop thinking about Malik. There was something about the boy's eyes, the way they seemed to hold 1,000 untold stories. And then there was the matter of the shoes. James couldn't explain it, but something about that detail nagged at him. A boy without shoes on a night like this. It wasn't just tragic, it was strange, unusual, almost as if it was connected to something bigger. James didn't know what that something was yet, but he was determined to find out. And he had a feeling that whatever he uncovered, it was going to change everything. The following day, James couldn't shake the thought of Malik. He'd done his usual rounds, checking in on the usual corners of the city, but his mind kept drifting back to that boy with the bare feet and the guarded eyes. Something about the situation didn't sit right with him. Maybe it was the way Malik talked about his past, as if it was something he had to protect himself from. Or maybe it was the eerie way he had evaded details, leaving James with more questions than answers. James decided to follow up with the shelter. Sarah picked up the phone almost immediately, her voice as warm as it had been the night before. Malik. "Oh, he's still here," she said. "Quiet kid. He ate breakfast this morning. But he doesn't talk much. We're giving him some space for now." James felt a small wave of relief, but it was short-lived. Did he mention anything about his family? Or where he's been staying? There was a pause on the other end of the line. "No, nothing specific. But there's something about him, James. I don't know how to explain it. He's carrying a lot, you can just tell. He did ask about you, though." "About me?" James asked, surprised. "Yeah, he wanted to know if you were coming back." James felt a strange mix of emotions, gratified, worried, and even more determined. "I'll stop by later," he said. That evening, James returned to the shelter. Malik was sitting in the corner of the common room, his knees pulled up to his chest, watching the other kids play with donated toys. He looked up as James entered, his expression unreadable. "Hey, Malik," James said, crouching down to his level. "How's it going?" Malik shrugged. "It's okay." James gestured toward the noisy room. "Not too crowded for you?" Malik gave a small smile, the first one James had seen. "It's better than some places." James sat down next to him. "Malik, I've been thinking about what you told me. About your mom, the foster homes, all of it. I want to help you, but I need to know more. You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Malik's smile faded, and he stared at the floor. "It doesn't matter," he mumbled. "It does matter," James said firmly but gently. "It matters because you matter, and I can't help you unless I know what's going on." Malik was silent for a long time, the sounds of laughter and chatter filling the space between them. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to leave," he said. "But I didn't have a choice." James frowned. "Leave where?" Malik looked at him, his eyes glistening. "My mom. She was all I had. But when she got sick, everything fell apart. They said I had to go, that I couldn't stay with her anymore. They put me in a foster home. And it was bad, James. Real bad." James's chest tightened. He'd heard stories like this before. Kids shuffled from home to home, slipping through the cracks of a broken system. "Is that why you ran away?" Malik nodded. "I couldn't stay there. I couldn't trust anyone. So I left. I thought maybe I could find my mom again. But when I went back to where we used to live, she wasn't there. The building was empty." James felt a lump in his throat. He didn't know what to say, so he simply placed a hand on Malik's shoulder. "I'm sorry," he said. Malik shrugged off the sympathy, his face hardening again. "It's not your fault. I'm used to it." James leaned back, trying to piece everything together. There were still gaps, still questions, but one thing was clear. Malik had been failed by the people who were supposed to protect him. And now he was trying to survive in a world that didn't seem to care. But there was something else bothering James, something he couldn't ignore. The shoes. Malik's bare feet on that freezing night. It wasn't just neglect. It felt deliberate, almost like a statement. Malik, James said carefully, why weren't you wearing shoes that night? Malik hesitated, his eyes darting away. I had lost them, he said quickly. James raised an eyebrow. Lost them. How? Malik fidgeted, his hands twisting together. I don't want to talk about it, he muttered. James didn't push further, but the answer didn't sit right with him. Something about the way Malik avoided the question felt off, like there was more to the story. That night, after leaving the shelter, James decided to dig deeper. He pulled up the incident reports for the area where he'd found Malik, scanning for anything unusual. A few reports of stolen property, a handful of minor disturbances, nothing out of the ordinary. But then he came across something strange. A complaint filed earlier that day about a group of teenagers harassing people outside a convenience store. The description mentioned a young boy being cornered, barefoot and shivering, before running off. James's stomach dropped. Was Malik involved in this? Had he been targeted? Or worse, had he done something to provoke them? The next day, James returned to the shelter, determined to get answers. Malik was in the dining hall, poking at a plate of spaghetti. He looked up as James approached, his expression worry. Morning, James said, sitting down across from him. Can we talk? Malik sighed, setting his fork down. About what? James leaned forward, lowering his voice. I need you to be honest with me, Malik. Were you in trouble with some kids before I found you? Malik froze, his eyes widening. Why are you asking that? Because I need to know if you're safe, James said. If someone's after you, I need to know. Malik shook his head quickly. No one's after me, he said, but his voice wavered. Malik, James said gently, I saw a report. It said there was an incident near where I found you. Were you there? Malik hesitated, then nodded slowly. Yeah, I was there, he admitted, but it wasn't my fault. What happened? James asked. Malik's voice trembled as he spoke. They took my shoes, he said. They said I didn't belong there, that I should leave. I tried to fight back, but there were too many of them. James clenched his fists, anger bubbling inside him. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because it doesn't matter, Malik snapped. This happens all the time. No one cares. I care, James said firmly, and this does matter. You shouldn't have to go through this alone. Malik looked at him, his tough exterior cracking just a little. What are you going to do about it? He asked quietly. James didn't have an answer yet. But he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let Malik slip through the cracks again. Something had to be done. Something that would make a real difference. And he was determined to figure out what that was, no matter what it took. James couldn't let Malik's story rest. It was more than a professional obligation now. It was personal. He had seen too many kids fall through the cracks, their lives swallowed by circumstances they never chose. But Malik was different. There was a strength in him, a quiet resilience that refused to be extinguished, no matter how much the world seemed to push him down. James wasn't going to let that strength go to waste. After their conversation, James spent hours combing through reports and reaching out to people in the neighborhood where Malik had been found. Most people were reluctant to talk, whether out of fear or indifference, James couldn't tell. But then he got a lead from a store clerk who worked near the convenience store where the complaint had been filed. Yeah, I remember that night, the clerk said. There was a group of kids hanging around, real troublemakers. They've been harassing people for weeks. That boy you're asking about? I saw him run out, barefoot, looking terrified. It was like they were hunting him. James' chest tightened. Do you know who those kids were? The clerk hesitated, glancing around nervously. I've seen them before. They're not just kids. They run errands for one of the gangs around here. They don't usually go after random kids, though. Your boy must have done something to get on their bad side. James thanked the clerk and left, his mind racing. Gangs. It was a word he'd hoped wouldn't come into this, but now it was unavoidable. If Malik had crossed paths with people like that, the danger was far greater than James had realized. He needed to know exactly what had happened, and why. That night, James returned to the shelter, finding Malik sitting alone in the corner of a common room. The boy looked up as James approached, his expression guarded but not surprised. "I talked to some people," James said, sitting down beside him. "They told me about the group you ran into. Malik, you need to tell me the truth. What happened that night?" Malik's jaw tightened and he looked away. "I already told you," he muttered. "No," James said gently but firmly. "You told me part of it, but I need the whole story. If those kids are connected to a gang, they won't stop. They'll come after you again." Malik's eyes widened, fear flickering across his face. "They don't care about me," he said quickly. "I'm nobody to them." "Then why did they take your shoes?" James pressed. "Why were they chasing you?" Malik hesitated, his hands clenching into fists. Finally he said, "I saw something I wasn't supposed to see." James's heart sank. "What did you see?" Malik swallowed hard. "I was trying to stay warm. I found this alley behind a building, and there was a fire in a barrel. I thought it was empty, but it wasn't. They were there, those guys. I saw them passing something. Money, maybe drugs. I don't know. They saw me, and I ran. But they caught me, said I shouldn't have been there." James leaned back, his mind racing. If Malik had stumbled into a gang operation, it explained everything. The harassment, the stolen shoes. It was all about sending a message, scaring him into silence. But it also meant Malik was in real danger. "You're not safe, Malik," James said, his voice firm. "If they think you're a threat, they won't stop." Malik's eyes brimmed with tears, though he blinked them back quickly. "What am I supposed to do? I can't go back to the streets. I can't go anywhere." James placed a hand on Malik's shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone," he said. "I'll help you. We'll figure this out together." But even as he said the words, James knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Gangs didn't operate in the open, and getting them to back off wouldn't happen without a fight. Worse, Malik's reluctance to involve the authorities meant that James would have to tread carefully. The next day, James began reaching out to colleagues who had experience with gang-related cases. He needed to understand the dynamics of the group Malik had encountered and figure out how to neutralize the threat without putting the boy in even more danger. The more he dug, the more he realized just how deep the problem ran. The group Malik had stumbled upon was connected to a larger network that controlled parts of the neighborhood. They were small players in a much bigger game, but they were still dangerous. James knew he had to act quickly, but every step he took felt like walking a tightrope. Meanwhile, Malik stayed at the shelter, growing more withdrawn with each passing day. James visited whenever he could, trying to reassure him, but the boy's fear was palpable. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was only to ask questions that James couldn't answer. What if they find me? What if they come here? What happens if you can't stop them? James didn't have the answers, but he refused to let Malik see his uncertainty. "We'll keep you safe," he said each time. "I promise." But one evening, everything came to a head. James was at the station when he got a call from Sarah at the shelter. Her voice was frantic. "James, you need to get here now," she said. "There were some guys outside earlier, asking about Malik. I told them he wasn't here, but they didn't seem convinced." James felt his pulse quicken. "Is Malik okay?" "He's fine, but he's scared," Sarah said. "And so am I. These men weren't just looking. They were threatening." James was at the door before she finished speaking, his mind racing. Malik's fears weren't just in his head. The danger was real, and it was closing in. When James arrived at the shelter, he'd found Malik sitting in Sarah's office, his knees pulled up to his chest. He looked up as James entered, his face pale. "They were here," Malik said, his voice barely audible. James crouched down in front of him, his expression serious. "Listen to me, Malik. We're going to figure this out, but I need you to trust me. No more holding back. No more running. We're in this together. Malik nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and hope. But as James stood to leave, his phone buzzed with a text from one of his contacts in the neighborhood. It was a warning. Asterisk, the group knows about the kid. They're not backing off asterisk. James stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. This wasn't just about protecting Malik anymore. It was about confronting a danger that had been lurking in the shadows for far too long. As he looked back at Malik, huddled in the corner, James knew they were running out of time. The next move would decide everything, and the stakes had never been higher. James left the shelter with a heavy weight in his chest, the text message burning in his pocket like a ticking clock. The stakes had shifted, and the danger was no longer theoretical. Malik's life was on the line, and James was racing against a threat that seemed to grow larger with every passing minute. But just as he started his car, a thought struck him. Why now? Why were the gang members suddenly so intent on tracking Malik down? Something didn't add up. Malik had told James he saw something he shouldn't have. But was it the whole story? It seemed odd that a group with so much control over the area would invest this much effort in a lone boy, unless there was more to the situation than Malik was letting on. James decided he couldn't wait any longer. He drove straight to one of his trusted contacts in the neighborhood, a retired community leader named Marcus. Marcus had lived in the area for decades and knew its secrets better than anyone. When James explained the situation, Marcus leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. You're saying the boy saw a deal go down? That's what he told you? That's all I've got, James said, frustration creeping into his voice. But it doesn't make sense. Why go to these lengths over a kid who's just trying to survive? Marcus nodded slowly. It doesn't fit. They don't waste resources like this unless there's something big at stake. He paused, then fixed James with a sharp look. You sure the boy's telling you everything? James hesitated. Malik had been reluctant to talk from the start. But was he hiding something more? I don't know, he admitted. But I need to find out. Fast. Marcus sighed. There's one more thing you should know. That group you're dealing with, they've been making moves lately, expanding their territory, taking bigger risks. If the boy stumbled onto something important, something they're trying to keep quiet. James didn't need him to finish the sentence. The implications were clear. Malik might have seen something far more dangerous than a routine exchange. With Marcus' warning ringing in his ears, James headed back to the shelter. This time his approach was more direct. He found Malik in the common room, sitting by himself as usual. Malik, James said, pulling up a chair, we need to talk, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Malik looked at him warily. I already told you what happened. I know, James said, but I think there's more to the story. What exactly did you see that night? Malik's eyes darted away, and James could see the battle playing out inside him, the fear of speaking up versus the guilt of holding back. Finally, the boy sighed and leaned in closer, lowering his voice. They weren't just trading money, he whispered. There was a bag, a big one. I saw them open it, just for a second. There were weapons inside, guns. James's stomach dropped. This was worse than he'd imagined. A gang smuggling weapons wasn't just a neighborhood problem. It was a citywide threat. And Malik had been an unwitting witness to the whole thing. Why didn't you tell me this before? James asked, struggling to keep his voice calm. I was scared, Malik said, his voice rising. I thought if I told you, they'd find me and... He stopped, his breath hitching. James put a hand on his shoulder. I get it, he said softly. But now we know what we're dealing with, and we're not going to let them hurt you. But even as he spoke, James knew the situation had just become infinitely more complicated. The gang wasn't just trying to intimidate Malik into silence. They were trying to eliminate a witness. And if they were trafficking weapons, they wouldn't hesitate to use them. Later that night, as James sat in his car outside the shelter, his phone buzzed with another text. It was from Marcus. Asterisk heard some chatter. They're looking for the boy near the old warehouse on Pine Street. Be careful asterisk. James' pulse quickened. The warehouse was notorious as a meeting point for illegal activity, but it was also only a few blocks from the shelter. If the gang was actively searching for Malik, it was only a matter of time before they found him. James knew he had to act, but as he started the car, his phone rang. It was Sarah, her voice trembling on the other end. "James, he's gone," she said. "What do you mean, gone?" James asked, his heart pounding. "Malik," Sarah said. "He left the shelter. One of the kids saw him sneaking out a little while ago. I don't know where he went." James clenched the steering wheel. "I think I do," he said grimly. He hung up and sped toward Pine Street, his mind racing. Malik must have overheard something or figured out that the gang was close. And if he was heading to the warehouse, it could only mean one thing. He was trying to confront them himself. When James arrived, the area was eerily quiet. The warehouse loomed in the darkness, its broken windows glowing faintly from the light inside. James parked a safe distance away and moved cautiously toward the building, his hand resting on the radio at his belt. As he approached, he heard voices, low and threatening. He peered through a crack in the door and saw Malik standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by several gang members. One of them was holding Malik's old sneakers, dangling them mockingly. "You think you can just run away from us?" one of the men said, stepping closer to Malik. "You made a mistake coming here, kid." James's heart raced. He couldn't just rush in. He needed a plan. But as he scanned the room, his eyes landed on something that made his blood run cold. A table piled high with guns and ammunition. This wasn't just about Malik anymore. This was a full-scale operation, and Malik was caught in the middle of it. James reached for his radio, whispering into it as quietly as he could. "This is Officer James Carter. I need backup at the warehouse on Pine Street. Situation involves armed suspects and a minor and immediate danger. Proceed with caution." As he waited for backup, James knew he had to stall for time. But how? The gang members were focused on Malik, their attention razor sharp. And Malik, to his credit, wasn't backing down. "You think I'm scared of you?" Malik said, his voice trembling but defiant. "I'm not scared anymore." James felt a surge of pride, even as his fear for Malik's safety grew. The boy was standing up for himself, refusing to be silenced. But would it be enough to buy them the time they needed? The seconds ticked by like hours as James positioned himself closer to the door, ready to act the moment backup arrived. But the gang wasn't waiting. One of the men reached for Malik, and the room erupted in chaos. The moment the gang member grabbed Malik's arm, James made his move. Bursting through the warehouse door, his voice rang out with commanding authority. "Police, let him go." The men froze for a split second, caught off guard by the sudden interruption. Malik's eyes widened in surprise, but James barely had time to register the boy's reaction. The gang members quickly snapped out of their shock, and one of them reached toward the table where the weapons were piled. "Don't even think about it," James shouted, his hand resting firmly on his holstered firearm. He had no intention of drawing it unless absolutely necessary, but he needed them to know he wasn't bluffing. Back away from the table. Now. The leader of the group, a wiry man with a cold, calculating gaze, stepped forward slowly, raising his hands in mock surrender. "You've got guts coming in here alone, officer," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "But you should thought this through." James didn't flinch. "I'm not alone. Backup is on its way, and you don't want to be here when they arrive. Let the boy go, and maybe we can all walk out of this without anyone getting hurt." The leader glanced at his men, weighing his options. For a moment, it seemed like he might back down. But then he smirked, a cruel glint in his eye. "You don't get it, do you? This kid made himself a problem. And problems don't just walk away." James' heart pounded as the tension in the room reached a breaking point. The gang members began shifting uneasily, their hands inching toward their weapons. James could feel the seconds slipping away, each one closer to chaos. Then from outside, the sound of approaching sirens pierced the night. The gang members exchanged panicked glances, their bravado crumbling in the face of an imminent police raid. "Time's up," James said firmly, stepping closer to Malik. "Let him go." The leader cursed under his breath, but he finally nodded to his men. "Let's get out of here," he barked. One by one, they began retreating, disappearing into the shadows of the warehouse. James moved quickly to Malik's side, pulling the boy away from the danger. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice urgent. Malik nodded, though his legs were trembling. "I'm fine," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Before James could respond, the leader turned back, his expression dark. "You think this is over?" he sneered. "It's not." But before he could say more, the sound of police cars screeching to a halt outside cut him off. Officers flooded the warehouse, their weapons drawn, and within moments, the gang was subdued and handcuffed. James let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was over. Malik was safe, and the gang's operation had been shut down. But just as James began to relax, Malik tugged at his sleeve. "James," he said quietly, his eyes wide with fear, "there's something you need to see." James followed Malik's gaze to the far corner of the warehouse, where a locked storage container sat partially hidden beneath a tarp. Something about it felt wrong, out of place even in this chaotic scene. With a nod from the commanding officer on the scene, James approached the container and pried it open. What he found inside stopped him cold. It wasn't just more weapons. There were detailed maps, marked with locations across the city, and stacks of cash bundled with foreign currency. But what stood out most was a list of names, dozens of them, including several individuals James recognized as community leaders and local business owners. "This isn't just about guns," James muttered, his mind racing. "This is part of something bigger." Malik stood beside him, his face pale. "I didn't know about any of this," he said, his voice trembling. James placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's okay. You did the right thing, Malik. Because of you, we can stop this before it gets worse." As the officers began cataloging the evidence, James realized the night's events were only the beginning. The gang's operation wasn't just a local threat. It was part of a larger network with far-reaching implications. But for now, he turned his attention back to Malik. The boy had been through more than anyone his age should ever have to face, but he had shown courage and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. "Let's get you out of here," James said, guiding Malik toward the waiting patrol cars. As they walked, Malik looked up at him, his expression uncertain. "Do you think they'll come after me again?" James paused, meeting Malik's gaze. "Not if I have anything to say about it," he said firmly. "You're not alone in this anymore." And for the first time, Malik allowed himself a small, tentative smile. As they drove away from the warehouse, James couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover, more battles to fight. But for now, he was content knowing that one life had been saved, one small victory won. What neither of them realized, however, was that far away, in a dimly lit room, a figure was studying the list of names James had found. With a slow, deliberate motion, the figure crossed out Malik's name and circled another. The fight was far from over. In the days following the warehouse raid, life in the community slowly began to shift. The immediate danger to Malik had been neutralized, but the reality of what they had uncovered left a ripple effect that couldn't be ignored. The gang's operation was far more intricate than anyone had imagined, and as the police worked to dismantle the network, James found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him and Malik to this point. For Malik, the aftermath was a mixture of relief and uncertainty. The shelter provided him with a safe place to stay, but the trauma of everything he had endured lingered. James visited him regularly, checking in not just as an officer, but as someone who genuinely cared. Over time, Malik began to open up more, sharing pieces of his past and the dreams he thought he'd lost. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, James and Malik sat on the shelter's steps, watching kids play basketball in the courtyard. Malik was quieter than usual, his eyes fixed on the ball bouncing across the pavement. "You've been pretty quiet today," James said, nudging him lightly. "Something on your mind?" Malik shrugged. "I guess I'm just wondering. What happens next? For me, for all of this?" He gestured vaguely, as if trying to encompass the chaos of the past few weeks. James took a moment before responding. What happens next is up to you. You've been through a lot, more than most people your age should ever have to deal with. But you've also proven you're stronger than you think. This is your chance to start fresh, to figure out what you want and go after it. Malik looked at him skeptically. It's not that easy. No, it's not, James admitted. But nothing worth doing ever is. The important thing is that you don't have to do it alone. You've got people in your corner now, Sarah, the folks at the shelter of me. We're here to help you figure it out. Malik didn't respond right away, but a small, thoughtful smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Meanwhile, James found himself drawn deeper into the investigation that had begun with the warehouse. The evidence they'd uncovered pointed to a sprawling network that extended far beyond the city limits. It was daunting work, but James knew that every step they took was another move toward ensuring the safety of kids like Malik. During one particularly long day at the precinct, Marcus stopped by to check in. The older man had been following the developments closely and was impressed by the progress being made. You've done good work, James, Marcus said, clapping a hand on his shoulder. But don't forget to take a moment and breathe. This kind of thing can eat you alive if you let it. James nodded, appreciating the advice. I know. It's just, I see kids like Malik, and I can't help but think about how many more are out there, stuck in situations like his. That's true, Marcus agreed, but you helped one. And that matters. Don't lose sight of that. Those words stayed with James in the weeks that followed, serving as a reminder to focus on the victories, no matter how small they might seem. He carried them with him one afternoon when he arrived at the shelter to find Malik waiting for him with a nervous but determined expression. I've been thinking about what you said, Malik began, shuffling his feet awkwardly. About figuring out what I want. And I think I want to go back to school. James's face lit up with a genuine smile. That's a great idea, Malik. I know it won't be easy, but I think you'll do great. Malik nodded, his confidence bolstered by James' encouragement. I know it's going to be hard, but I'm tired of feeling like I can't do anything. I want to try. From that moment on, James and Sarah worked tirelessly to help Malik enroll in a local program designed for kids who had fallen through the cracks. They helped him gather the necessary documents, navigate the red tape, and prepare for his first day. It wasn't a quick process, but Malik's determination never wavered. On the morning of his first class, James arrived at the shelter early to drive him. Malik was dressed in clothes donated by the community, and though they were slightly too big, he wore them with a sense of pride. As they pulled up to the school, Malik hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the door handle. What if I can't do it? He asked quietly, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at him all morning. James turned to him with a steady gaze. You've already done the hard part, Malik. You made the choice to try. That's more than a lot of people ever do. The rest is just one step at a time. Malik took a deep breath and nodded. Okay, he said, his voice firm. Let's do this. Watching Malik walk into the school was a moment James would never forget. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a new beginning, one that felt full of hope and possibility. As the weeks turned into months, Malik began to find his footing. He struggled at times. There were days when the weight of his past threatened to pull him under, but he always found a way to push through. And every time he did, he grew a little stronger, a little more confident. James stayed in touch, attending parent-teacher meetings in Malik's stead and cheering him on at every milestone. The bond they had formed through their shared experiences became a source of strength for both of them, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was light to be found. By the time Malik graduated from the program, he was a different person. The shy, fearful boy James had met on that freezing night had grown into a young man with a clear sense of purpose. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, Malik faced it with a courage that inspired everyone around him. At the graduation ceremony, Malik stood at the podium to give a short speech. His hands trembled as he held the microphone, but his voice was steady as he began. I didn't think I'd make it here, he said, his eyes scanning the crowd. There were a lot of times when I wanted to give up, when I thought I wasn't good enough. But someone told me that the hardest part is deciding to try. And they were right. Because once I started trying, I realized I could do more than I thought. He paused, his gaze landing on James, who sat in the front row, beaming with pride. So to everyone who believed in me, who gave me a chance when I didn't believe in myself. Thank you. I couldn't have done this without you. As the crowd erupted into applause, James felt a lump rise in his throat. This wasn't just Malik's victory. It was a testament to the power of community, of second chances, and of the simple yet profound impact of showing up for someone in need. Driving home that evening, James couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led them to this point. The world was far from perfect, and there would always be challenges to face. But knowing that Malik's story had taken a turn toward hope made it all feel worthwhile. For Malik, it was the beginning of a new chapter. For James, it was a reminder of why he had chosen this path in the first place. And for both of them, it was proof that even in the coldest of nights, there was always a chance for warmth and light to break through.